Thanks, Renee, and welcome everybody. We really appreciate you being here for this edition of IPWatchdog Unleashed. We're here in the studio. We've just concluded our life sciences program, and our guest this week is Rob Sahr, and Rob was co-chair of the program, and he is a shareholder at Wolf Greenfield in Boston, and he's been here the last couple days, so I thought maybe it would be a good opportunity for us to sit one-on-one and chat about what's going on in the life sciences industry and so forth. So first, I really appreciate your support over the years, and I appreciate your participation in helping me plan these events, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Gene, and I really appreciate this conference and what you're doing. I remember years ago, I had sort of read a couple of blogs, and I thought, who is this Gene Quinn guy? He's very strongly opinionated. But then coming here and seeing the programs that you put on and the message that you're delivering and the motivation of why it matters to talk about this and who do you need to tell these stories to, I really do appreciate that work. I think that's vital for our industry.
Well, great. Thanks. I appreciate that. And I do think if you take a position and can back up why you have that position, you're going to either convince some people that, oh, amen, brother, I really agree with that, or you'll see people who say, well, no, I disagree with that. But then because I've taken such a strong position, they're better able to articulate why they disagree with me. And it's those moments that when you crystallize the issues, and sometimes people can convince me, and sometimes they can't, but it makes for a really interesting conversation. Yeah, and so I appreciate you being here, and I thought one of the things that maybe we could just start and see where it leads us is like so many folks in this industry, the life sciences industry / patent field, you started off not as a patent attorney. You did not go straight from college to law school like. You spent time you were a scientist.
I was, yeah.
So tell us the story. Where did you start your science career? And then I'm going to also ask you what provoked you to get into patents. But let's start with the science part.
I got the interest as an undergrad, and there was a professor who taught a course at SUNY Albany. It was called Brain, the Final Frontier. And I thought, wow, this sounds pretty interesting. And it was. It really got me excited about neuroscience. And after undergrad, I went on to graduate school and moved to Indiana from upstate New York. Was in a graduate program there doing research, and met my wife there, who then went on to Eli Lilly, so to work in the pharmaceutical industry. And that seemed like great fun, so I followed her and I did that for a few years. And it was an interesting time at Lilly. It was after Prozac, but it was, I think Zyprexa for schizophrenia was one of the big selling drugs at the time. And there were so many interesting patent cases. I was there when the Merck KGA safe harbor cases had come out. The obviousness was an issue for Zyprexa. Written description became a big deal. The Ariad decision from the district court came out, and that seemed to get the entire company excited about things, and the lawyers would go to grand rounds and talk about the cases. And I loved what I did. Like in research, I was at the bench, gloves and goggles on, but it was very, very, very early stage R&D. And the things I was working on, I cared greatly about it. A few other people cared greatly about it, but the rest of the company, it didn't really have an impact on them. But I saw on the patent side, that's really where a lot of action was, and I wanted to be a part of that.
You gave me a perfect segue to talk about drug development. And I know one of the things that we talked about maybe sharing was this idea, how do drugs get developed, and particularly maybe hitting the narrative that, well, the government develops drugs anyway, so why are we paying so much, which is not true, and why is that not true?
Yeah, so how are drugs developed? I'd say like 3 or 4 miracles that happen consecutively, and it really is. And I often hear this narrative when people are talking about Bidol or expensive drugs, and they say, why are we paying so much for it? They're just selling a drug that the government paid for. We paid for it already. And my thought is just always that is completely absurd. Like, what did the government pay for? And I will say, the government funding has a very important role. It does help companies to get off the ground, sort of to develop maybe platform technology, to advance things so that it's ready to be partnered and have somebody develop products from that technology. But it's far from developing an actual therapeutic. Let's just pretend that there was a government-funded a project to come up with a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And let's say hundreds of molecules were screened, and the actual one that would work was found. Now, it rarely gets that far with government funding. Let's just pretend they sorted through the chemicals and they found one, like, yeah, this one. If it gets to, this part of the brain and nowhere else, it will cure. It will slow down and prevent Alzheimer's disease. Right here in this vial. Here it is. Here you go. This is what you paid for, right? Politician, what are you going to do with that? Right? What are you going to do with that? That is just the early beginning stage. Now, a ton of work had to go into getting there, but that is nowhere near an actual therapeutic.
You don't know whether it's going to work. You don't know whether it's going to kill more people than it saves. You don't know whether you can actually get it to that part of the brain.
That's right, right. And
those are just three problems.
I hinted at a couple of things, right? It has to get to this part of the brain and only this part of the brain, right? What if it has, it has a mechanism of activity that does something in the liver so that you can't dose it the way you want? Well, maybe you need to figure out a trick to get around that. Maybe you need to get it so that it remains stable. It doesn't have side effects. How are you going to figure out how to dose it? Do you have to give it a lot of it? Does it have to inhibit something? Does it have to inhibit it all the time, intermittently? Like, all of those things need to be figured out before something can become a therapeutic. And so many more things can go awry along the way.
The way I like to try and explain it to people is that the role the government plays, I think, is critical, because so much of what you all do in the life sciences space, it feels like it's Merlin type magic, right? And wouldn't it be great if you could take a pill and I just swallow the pill and it would cure whatever cancer I have? Yeah. That would be fantastic. But that's pie in the sky level research that we can't expect the private sector to chase. Yeah. And what the government does is they seed research of what seems to be the impossible. That kind of research that private company couldn't justify doing. And then some of it goes nowhere, and probably a lot of it goes nowhere. Way more than some of it that succeeds, most of it goes nowhere. But you do get trickle up miracles, as you called it. And then once you see that miracle, now the private sector company, with the might of their investors and their research teams, knows, okay, there's something there. We can work with that.
Yeah.
And that's the virtuous cycle. So it's not to belittle the role of the government, but it's like less than 1% of the overall spending to get a drug over the finish line.
The spending, the effort, the risk. I mean, I use that example of here's the vial because I was the person who was handed that vial. My job oftentimes was to go to our chemistry team and pick up the latest thing that they made in a vial and then go back into the lab and, see what it could do. But I knew, from firsthand experience that it was years away from ever getting to the point where you could even test it in a person to see if it did what it was supposed to. And
well, it's really years before you can even test it in an animal, right? I mean, because you don't know what do I do? Is it an ointment? Do I have to inject it? Can I be a pill? Right? I mean, and body weight, how much do they need? I mean, it doesn't help you if you're going to kill all the mice because you've dosed them so high. I mean, this stuff is complicated stuff, and a lot of people, I don't think, and certainly in DC, a lot of policymakers don't understand that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even if it gets far enough to people, there are multiple ways that a trial can fail to produce the results that are necessary for the FDA to approve a therapeutic. And those trials can be super expensive. We mentioned Alzheimer's disease. Like, how do you prove that your therapy slows Alzheimer's disease, right? Unless it's instantly removing all the symptoms, you have to test it over time to see if it's doing what it's supposed to do. And that takes hundreds of millions of dollars and multiple patients just to find out, does it do what we hoped? And if the answer is no, that's a tremendous sunken cost.
Mm-hmm. And you don't often, in fact, you very rarely see that instant gratification in the clinical trials, right? And I know that to be true simply because occasionally you will hear, well, the clinical trial has been shut down, not because it didn't work, but because it has worked beyond our wildest dreams, and now it's no longer ethical to have a placebo group. But that happens almost never. And it makes such big news in the industry when it happens, because it's like, wow, we got to rush this. We got to get this to market, help all the people we can. That's just not the experience. The experience is, in so many places in this area, it's incremental. You're better off. We're moving science, and we're getting better. We're going to help you live longer. We're going to treat your pain. And then along the way, occasionally we have these true fantastic science fiction level miracles, and that's what we all hope for.
Yeah.
And all right, so that's how you got onto the patent team, because you wanted to be an action hero. I love that story. That's the way I'm going to tell your story from now on. But where did you go to law school, and what did you do while you were in law school? Were you still working at the bench, or did you transition to becoming a tech spec or a patent agent, or when did that all really materialize?
So for part of the time I was working, I was drug discoverer by day and law student by night for the first couple of years. And then I joined a law firm.
As a tech spec, or did that even exist back then?
In Indiana at the time, it didn't exist the way it does in other places. So I remember even going to the career development at the law school and saying, hey, I'm a scientist. Do you think there's any law firms that might need a scientist, like in patent law? And they're like, no, that's not a
that
thing.
Sounds crazy now, right? I mean, because that's what law firms do. They look for people like you, and they bring you in, and then they train you, and then they want you to stay once you.
Yeah, but a friend of our family was a patent attorney at IBM, and encouraged to just go ahead and reach out. And so I just emailed a bunch of law firms anyway, like, hey, I'm a scientist. Do you have any need for somebody like me? And one of them responded, and so I went there. They called me a law clerk because I was in law school, and it was new to them. They didn't even know how to pay me. Do you just for every hour, for a billable hour? What do we do with this person? But eventually a couple other people joined. When I moved to Boston, I realized that's just the norm. That's like the farm team. Law firms just gobble up PhDs and postdocs with no legal experience, and they take them in for the scientific expertise and then train them up to be patent agents and lawyers.
You guys send them to Suffolk, so they work for you during the day, and then they're going to night school at Suffolk, which I think is still the only night program in Boston. I could be wrong now, but for a while it was the only night program. So you see a lot of firms creating the people that they need, going out and finding the scientists that matters to them because of the clients they have.
Yeah, and I met somebody here, actually a couple of people who were scientists who were saying I'm thinking of going into law. How does that happen?
Yeah, and I think we talked to the one woman together, and she was like, "Well, is there going to be a job for me?" You have a PhD. They hire you because of the science, because you can do real work day one.
Yeah, and on that topic, one thing that sort of bothers me, thinking ahead to the future, is the cutting of research funds. Sometimes to be punitive, sometimes thinking this just isn't something we should be doing. And my concern is that years from now, we won't have the trained people to either do the research or support the research. Even my own graduate project. So what disturbs me is when universities are rescinding offers for graduate students, and they're sort of trimming the number of people they can take and train. To me, that's a tremendous loss that we might not feel for a while, but in another 5-10 years from now, the ramifications of that may be manifest. I was saying, even my own project, like in graduate school, my project was kind of dumb, not important. Apologies to my advisor, but I mean, there was no major breakthrough, but it taught me science and research, and to me, that was money well spent, and I would want my tax money to be training others like that as well. I think we're going to need more people like that, more people who pursue a new therapy and patent it and can save other lives.
I worry about that too, not only for our space, for training attorneys, but also for researchers. I mean, you see, it's getting easier and easier to use artificial intelligence. It's getting better and better, literally quarter by quarter, if not month by month, it gets better. I don't know that people are going to know how to research or have the incentive to research. And right now, at least, artificial intelligence is not at a place where you can rely on any answer you get. You got to trust but verify. But along the way, people, I think, are starting to rely on it already too early. And I think AI is becoming too much of a crutch.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're onto something. One thing that I lamented as certain pharma companies shed researchers and began to outsource and partner was that my worry was, if you do it too much, you're not going to have the in-house experience of people who actually do it themselves and know what's real and what isn't. Even when I was a scientist, I did much of the work myself and with others, but from time to time we might outsource a particular study to a vendor, like do this and send us the data. And I could just look at the data, just look at the raw numbers and instantly know, no, something went wrong with this experiment. This didn't actually test the hypothesis we wanted. This was a bust. And my concern is, if you lose the ability to recognize that, you're going to be led down the wrong path. And sort of the same with AI. You might just say, tell me this or do this, and you'll get something back. But if you don't know, it could do harm and it could lead you astray.
It's all about critical thinking and critical analysis.
That's a better way to phrase it, yeah.
I do think it's that skill set, that looking at something and saying, this was what I expected, this is not what I expected. And if it's not what I expected, is that because there's some innovation there, some synergy that I wasn't anticipating but I have identified, and now I need to figure out the mechanisms? Or was it because I made a mistake and set things up improperly or recorded it improperly? But at those moments of this is not what I expected, there is a possible miracle waiting to happen.
Serendipity, that's the other thing that's lost. I heard so many stories of people who discovered new therapies when they were looking for something else, and they noticed an effect, like, oh, how did that happen? I mean, there's some obvious ones, right? The blood pressure ones.
The microwave. The guy was doing research and melted the chocolate in his pocket. And he's like, okay, what's going on here? And then we have microwaves because of that. And there's all kinds of things that come up through happenstance, and then you have to peel back the layer. Not that this is, I'm going to just say this because it's one probably everybody can relate to, and particularly Halloween is later on this week as of the time we're recording this. The most popular candy in America, maybe the world, is Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. And
my wife's favorite. When
they built the factory and he moved it out of his kitchen and built the factory to do it, they had over roasted the peanuts. And he borrowed all kinds of money. There was no money left over to go out and get new peanuts to do, so they had to make do. So he tasted it, and he's like, this is actually better. And that's why with Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, if you take just like Skippy or Jif peanut butter and you take chocolate, it's like, that doesn't taste the same. It's because it doesn't. because Reese's uses a slightly burnt chocolate, slightly burnt peanut roast. And it makes all the difference in the world juxtaposed next to the chocolate. And that's just one area of serendipity. And it's identifying those happy mistakes, and then being able to critically think about, well, where did that come from? And now that I like that, how do I repeat that? And that's the scientist's life, right? That's why you take notes. Do scientists actually still keep notebooks? Or do they keep records somehow? Because some inventors don't do it anymore. Maybe that's news to you, because in your area, I think they do scrupulously.
We were very heavily trained. It was sort of like kindergarten. I would have to cut out pages from printouts or raw data, tape it in my notebook, and then sign it, have it countersigned and dated, and fill in spaces where there were blanks. So that was sort of back in the day. I didn't understand it then, but when I went into patent law, I realized, oh, okay, yeah. This is the actual proof of invention if there's an interference or perhaps a trade secret issue that we need to show, like we had it here at this time. A lot of things I began to appreciate after I became a patent attorney that I didn't necessarily appreciate as a scientist. A couple things offhand, I remember when they installed corridors and you couldn't just walk through the building, you needed a key card for everything. And it made no sense to me why I had to do that 2 or 3 times to walk from one building to another. Of course, after I became a patent attorney, I began to appreciate, oh, that's for trade secret protection. It's even if it's not actually protecting secrets, no one's going to break in and get through 3 different doors. That's a reasonable measure to protect a trade secret. So that one made sense to me. The reduction in publications. So as a scientist, you want to publish everything you can, and the company frowned upon that. And, I was outraged like every other scientist. How can we not, this is our career and our livelihood, and if we ever leave this job, we need a publication history so people know what we are and who we're doing. We have credibility. Once I became a patent attorney, I understood, it's probably not a good idea to let everybody publish on every finding they have.
Yeah, there's a lot of things the older that you get and the more experience you get, you understand the wisdom of. Let's pivot just a minute here, because one of the things I've been asking people throughout this event is about their experiences and how cancer has touched their life. And it touched so many lives. It's touched my life. My mother passed away from lung cancer. And in this field, the one thing that I find remarkable, because I really believe people, the scientists, when they say, we're doing this because we want treatments to get out there. And the more scientists you speak to, the more patent people you speak to, and the more executives at these companies that you speak to, that's not just what they say in front of the cameras. That's what they say behind the cameras. There's a different motivation in this industry. Yeah, you got to make money to fund this. You need to have successes so the investors see the promise and that they get involved. But the people are really trying to save lives. They're trying to make lives better, and I really believe that. So maybe start there. That's your understanding, right? That was what you were doing.
That's the dream. That's the motivation of everybody who's in the lab. It's not easy to do that. It takes a lot of school and it's a lot of work and effort. But that's what every person I knew in the labs, that was their goal. They wanted to treat some disease, and that's what they spent all their time at work and outside of work thinking about. That was the mission.
And right before we came out here and started recording, we talked a little bit about cancer and about, maybe the goal right now is with treatments is just stay alive, just keep fighting, because it keeps getting better and better and better, right?
Yeah, and I mentioned to you a family member who had lymphoma and needed some radiation treatment, but then could also, lymphoma is a blood cancer. You don't know if the blood cells are, concentrated in one area, but then also sort of floating around the body, just waiting to start dividing again and come back. I was so relieved to know that there was a systemic therapy, an antibody, that she could take that would prevent the relapse, and so far it has. And it gave me great comfort as well to know that even if this one antibody stopped working to kill the bad B cells, clients of mine were developing next generation therapies to get at them another way. And it just felt so good to be able to explain that to her. She's also a scientist. She picked it up pretty quickly. But just to know that, like, here's a therapy that is going to keep you around, and we need not worry, because if it ever does come back and this therapy stops working, the next one is already pretty close to coming out that will then work.
And that's why we do what we do in this space, to change lives, to make people's lives better, to stop pain, suffering, to cure disease. And the patent system, I feel, maybe you can comment on this, I feel plays an essential role in that.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's what attracts the investors.
Yeah, and it was particularly devastating to me when I saw some Federal Circuit cases sort of doing away with things that in my view were inventive. The Juno versus Kite case, which was about improvement to CAR T therapy, which is the type of therapy I was talking about. Like, if this antibody stops working, well, now we have this. That sort of got off the ground because people discovered a new platform technology, like a new backbone that would be applicable to all types of this CAR T therapy. And unfortunately, it seems when their case got before the Federal Circuit said, no, this patent, the claims in this patent are no good, because they recited a binder, the part of the CAR T that's going to bind to a specific antigen on a tumor cell. So that's how they work. You have the cell, it's the killer cell, but then you have to, tell it where to go, and you could tell it to go to a number of different cells. But in this case, it was to a particular antigen on a tumor cell, on B cells. And the court said these claims fail for lack of written description. And what bothered me so much is I felt like the court failed to appreciate exactly what was the invention there. I don't know what was behind it or why they were applying, antibody law to something that involved a binder but wasn't quite that. And to me, it was just another example of, I don't know, maybe it's not the judge's fault. I don't know who was telling the story, but it frustrated me that they couldn't appreciate this is actually what the improvement is. This is the invention. It's to this platform. And then, apply the law appropriately to what the invention is. And I feel we haven't seen a lot of, as much of that as we should. I hear Judge Newman, I hear Judge Michel, and I'm sort of nostalgic for the 80s, where it seemed like there was inspired legislation. That's when Bayh-Dole came out, and the Federal Circuit was put together for this purpose, to have a judiciary that would appreciate and understand what is the actual invention and how can we further the development and incentivize inventions like that.
Well, one of the things that really irritates me in just generally, and this is across the board, not just in the life sciences area, is the length of patents. And we had Sherry Knowles was talking about some of the patents that related to certain cancer treatments. And she had the patents up here, and she is a prop with her. Yeah. And I don't know whether folks in the audience could see it, but like the older the patent was, the shorter the patent was. The more new the patent was, the longer the patent was. And that's not just in the life sciences, that's across the board. I mean, even if you're going to patent like a dog toy or a game or something like that, what the patent needed to be 50 years ago or 100 years ago is one length, and what it needs to be today is probably 10 to 20 times that length, at least at a minimum. And back then, we all knew what the invention was. Patents were 100 years ago, one page of drawings and largely one page of text. And everybody knew. And the claim was even, I claim what I've described here, which is a cure for cancer or whatever you're claiming back then. Now today, there's all kinds of pages of claims. Nobody can understand the claims, real people at least, you know. And even if we're honest, patent attorneys can't understand the claims just picking up a patent and reading it. You got to look at the spec. You got to understand, and increasingly you have to have some idea of why is it written this way. Well, it's written that way because the Federal Circuit got this wrong, that wrong, this wrong. So that's the way we have to say it. Like in non-transitory signals. Okay, well, why do we have to call it non-transitory signals? Because they said if it's possible that it's a transitory signal, no patent for you, right? Yeah. So, you know, that's why. That's the only reason that these things say this. And I just think, and I say it all the time, the Federal Circuit doesn't give us any answers except for what you're doing right now is not enough. So then we do more, and we do more, and we do more, and then we wind up getting to the point where no layperson could ever pick up a patent and read it and understand what has been invented. And most patent attorneys can't unless it's specifically in an area where you do work. I mean, I read patents a lot. I get to the end of the patent and think to myself, gee, I wonder what they think is inventive here. And it's not that there's not something that's inventive there. There probably is all kinds of things that are inventive there. But you are actually disincentivized to point to what the invention is. Because if you do, then the examiners can say, oh, well, since you've described how well this innovation, what the innovation is and what the problem is that it's trying to solve, then that's just the logical next step, and therefore it's obvious and no patent for you. And it's like, huh? Because I did a good job explaining it to you, no patent for me. It's like no good deed goes unpunished. I mean, can you give the audience an idea, like the patents that you guys are writing today compared to the length of them that you were writing 10 years ago versus 20 years ago? They just keep ballooning, right?
Sometimes I make a conscious effort to trim them and just put what we need. So, you know, I start with what are we claiming and why, and then just the rest of the application is to support that.
So, but then you have to file more patents, right? Because the way you file, here's the big innovation that I've come up with, and I'm going to claim a little bit of it here. And if this winds up being useful, then I can claim a little bit more of it over here, and et cetera.
Yeah.
But that's been disincentivized too.
Yeah, and I should add with a caveat, it depends who I'm writing a patent application for. There are some where I know, like, this is the thing that we need to protect because this is the revenue stream. It's already identified. It's already in clinical trials. So that's what the patent is designed to do. There are others where it is sort of still developed, you know, platform technology where you have a good backbone and you know this could be the basis for several therapeutics, and the company wants to partner with a bunch of different people to allow a collaboration where multiple therapeutics can be developed using their platform. Those are really tricky right now because, again, you know, I look back to like the Juno case and say, well, I want to protect the platform, the real innovation, but I can't describe every little binder that might go on it someday. We don't even know what that is yet. So is it possible that I'm not going to be able to get a patent for this thing? Will they let me not include the binder and still have a valuable patent? We don't quite know how that's going to play out. We've seen a lot of...
We can guess.
Yeah.
Whatever you leave out was the thing that the Federal Circuit is going to say was the most critical thing, and how dare you.
Yeah. And I know Sherry mentioned this quite a bit too, but other problems with that, and not only written description, but double patenting. Again, like it comes back to bite the developer of the platform technology, who it's sort of, you can think of it as a broader claim. It's this backbone and this binder on it. And then a little while later, you know, there's a co-development of the platform with a particular binder on it or a different binder. And the patent office looks and says, well, there's the there's the same named inventor on that one as this one. So we're going to say there's double patenting, and the product-specific patent claim here anticipates or renders obvious the platform claim. Now, normally we might not care if the other one was developed much later, like, oh, I could file a terminal disclaimer over something that's going to expire 5 years later. That's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal if you don't have the common ownership and you can't file a terminal disclaimer. And that's a real world problem that I'm facing frequently when there are partners. One has platform technology and they want to partner with someone who's going to develop specific products. And the law is really complicating that right now.
Well, the law of double patenting is just complicated and complex, unnecessarily so. And I've shared my thoughts on that. I'll say it again. I think it's largely because it's judicially created, which is code for we're going to make this up as we go along, and we don't think you should get that patent on that unless you're willing to tie that to some other date. So we'll give you that if you're willing to tie. This is not Monty Hall. This is not let's make a deal here. The law should matter. It makes no sense whatsoever. The cases seem to contradict one another. And what we started to see is In Re Select got everybody all hot and bothered. And then 8 months later, it was the Allergan case came out. And it's like, oh, well, they decided maybe in the 8 months to go in a slightly different direction or pull back a little bit. Or how would you characterize what happened?
It's meandering. I mean, we're still waiting for it to sort out. It's leaning one way or another, and there were companies who had to make real decisions after Select and before Allergan, where here's a patent, and this is a patent with patent term extension, and it had a little bit of patent term adjustment, but there's another member in the family that didn't have as much patent term adjustment, or maybe didn't have any. So what I call their 154 terms, so not counting the PTE, were different. And the one with patent term extension on it was going to expire later. I know several companies who were faced with the dilemma, like, do we hope that the law turns in our way, like sort of like Allergan, like maybe I'll get the sympathy from the courts, or if we're wrong and that reference patent expires, even though I'm in my 5 years of PTE period, what Novartis versus Ezra made clear was there's a double patenting problem that isn't cured by a terminal disclaimer, and Behringer versus Barr says you can't file one over an expired patent. If I don't do something like tomorrow, the patent that I care about might be invalid. And there's no way to fix it because I can't file a terminal disclaimer. So I know some companies who actually filed those terminal disclaimers saying, well, I'll give up some of the term just to make sure that my patent's immune from double patenting from its child, from its other family member. And then, it was nice that the law turned a little bit in favor of patentees and Allergan, but that didn't help anybody who had to make those decisions and file the terminal disclaimers. And that's why I keep saying, just give me the law. I want to know the law. I'll abide by it. I may not like it, but if I know what it is, I can live with it.
But just to hear you say that, I mean, did I hear you correctly say that the parent is getting the child used against it?
Yeah.
For double patenting. I mean, that's just not the purpose of this doctrine, right?
Right.
I mean, so and that's the problem with the creep and the meandering and letting it be judicially created, which means we're making it up as we go along, is at some point you get so far away from what may have been at one point in time a legitimate concern that we were trying to make sure that patents didn't get extended beyond some reasonable, okay, we can all agree that this is the rule, this makes some sense, doesn't get extended beyond that, to then it's like, oh, well, the children and the grandchildren can be used against the parent. And it's like, well, whoa. That's not how this started. That's not where this was going back in the day.
And it even gets worse because the later families can be used against the early families. And what always has baffled me is there's some strange double patenting law that involves therapies, compositions of matter, the therapeutic, and then the method of using the therapeutic to treat a disease. I mentioned the other day I called them the shock the conscience cases, because I think that's a quote from one of the judges where it's like the Lilly versus Sun, and there's a Pfizer case and a couple others where they found that a patent that claimed a method of using a drug, that claim was invalid for non-statutory double patenting because of the composition of matter patent on the drug that came out earlier. So like you have a drug, and then years later you might figure out, something it can be used for, and at least one line of cases is saying, no, you can't get a patent on that new use because of the composition of matter. Now, that case has been sort of cabined and limited to its facts, but it's not dead. It's still precedent. That line is still out there. And then on the flip side, and this one's a little more black and white, a claim that recites a method of treating a disease that names a drug, we'll just say drug X, that method of using drug X, because it recites drug X, it anticipates or renders obvious the claim that's just to drug X, which may have been years earlier. Oftentimes that's, again, not such a huge deal if you're going to file a terminal disclaimer in the earlier one over the later. But it doesn't always work out that way. I mean, sometimes there's patent term adjustment, and sometimes there isn't identical ownership. And it's just, to me, completely senseless it's even vulnerable to it, especially if the composition of matter is open to the entire world, right? If we're seeing these rejections day to day, there's a composition of matter patent with composition of matter claims. It's published. It's out there for the whole world to say, here's this composition, do what you want with it, right? A few years later, a same inventor, maybe the same company, finds a new use for that composition. They go to patent that use. They get a double patenting rejection. Anyone else in the world could have gotten that claim, and there's nothing wrong. There's no issue for double patenting.
That's where we've jumped the shark, right?
Yeah.
So that when double patenting was, I thought, intended to benefit the original innovator and say, okay, we'll let you have this. But when double patenting hurts the original innovator and there's no rejection that could be made against somebody unrelated, that's just nonsensical. That's just crazy. But that's because double patenting, obviousness type double patenting, is not about obviousness. If it was about obviousness, it would make all the sense in the world, right? It's like, because then if you don't file the terminal disclaimer, then you'd be facing an obviousness rejection, and you can either overcome it or not. So it kind of lulls you into believing something reasonable, and then you look behind the curtain and you're like, well, geez, that's not what this is about at all on any level.
Yeah. And for a long time, I longed to get that set of facts in front of an appellate court, and that ought to force them to change the law. And I've come to appreciate that that's not enough, because the principles of party presentation will decide the actual issue before us, and if there's something slightly different, then the law will meander that way. And it's every problem that we've talked about at this conference with judge-made law, that it gets made up as it goes along,
and that's the problem. And going back to where you say this shock the conscience rule, what that really is, let's just translate that, what's going on there for people who aren't steeped in this industry. When they say it shocks the conscience, what it says is, I recognize that you're allowed to do that under the statute, but I think that doesn't make any sense, so I'm going to come up with some kind of equitable reason, judge-made reason, creep reason, that's going to say, yeah, you sort of have the right to do that under the statute, but that really can't be what was intended, so I'm going to come up with an exception, judicially created, non-statutory, some type of exception, because I don't think personally as a judge you should be able to do that. Judges are no longer just calling balls and strikes. They're not following what the law says. They're not following what the statute is. They're making it up as they go along. And I think the judiciary as a whole is really damaging the institution. Because the more you learn about what's going on in courts, it's like, how could this be? That's not what this was all about. Marbury versus Madison, Justice Marshall said, we will tell you what the law is, will be the final word on what the law says, where there's ambiguity, and we'll bring certainty to that. Fine. Where did that go? I mean, now they make it up, rewrite the statutes, or with 101, they say, Justice Thomas says, discoveries are not patent eligible. It doesn't matter how groundbreaking they are. Well, Your Honor, the Constitution and the statute, the one-sentence statute you're interpreting says otherwise.
Yeah, and I pulled it up on my screen and read it while you were discussing that with Sherry, and it was, I read the quote that I failed to appreciate the first time around. It was, no matter how groundbreaking, and then there's a word in the middle, and then it says, or brilliant discoveries are. And you know what the word in the middle was? Innovative.
Yeah.
No matter how, right? I'm like, wait, did he just pronounce that? Like,
did
something
he just say
innovative
that?
isn't patentable?
Yeah.
Like,
no, I know. It's just, it's unbelievable. Well, and as it turns out, the answer is yes. And we learned that with, what was it, the Ariosa case, right?
Yeah.
Where all the judges on the federal circuit that looked at that, and Judge Lynn, I think he was in concurring opinion, because he wrote something like, this is one of the top 10 most important medical innovations of all time.
Yeah.
But under the current Supreme Court law, it's not patent eligible. And that's just nonsensical, right? And for those who aren't familiar with that particular invention, it was essentially in order to determine whether or not the baby in the mother's womb had developmental disabilities. You would have to do a test that largely was safe, but when it wasn't safe, it had catastrophic consequences. It was very risky. It was a needle into the mother's belly, and it could go fine. It could go catastrophically bad for both the mother and for the unborn child. And what these inventors did is they made that completely and totally unnecessary, and figured out a way to get the same exact information from a blood test. So the reason Judge Lynn said that was one of the top 10 medical innovations of all time was you took catastrophic risk down to zero in all cases. And that is precisely what this is about: better, stronger, faster, safer.
Yeah.
And yet, no patent for you. I mean, I sometimes feel like I'm still asleep and this is a dream, and I'm going to wake up. Myriad and Mayo will never have happened, and I'm waiting for that.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, what message does that send? And maybe that doesn't deter the scientist who still thinks like, oh, I want to do this. This is the right thing to do. I'm going to, start a company and we're going to develop this. That motivation may still be there, but the funding won't be, right? The machinery that's required to turn the motivation and ideas into something tangible, like a cell-free DNA test, isn't going to be there if it's not protectable. And that's where I feel the majority of the harm is. I don't know if there's a lack of appreciation or not as to the reality of what's coming about from these decisions, the crippling.
Well, let me throw your industry under the bus just a little bit. Not you as patent attorney, but the science part of your industry. So I've said over the years that I know, and when I say it, people will always ask me, well, can you give me a citation for that? And then I can't, because what it is we all know, and all of you know, and all of you in the industry listening to this know that there are some of America's most prestigious research hospitals that are no longer conducting research into certain things. Why? Because they can't patent it. And if they can't patent it, they can't get the investment to stand up the startup company, and it will die anyway. So that we're going to just put our efforts somewhere else. Yeah. And I won't name any names, but some of the hospitals that are doing that, and everybody has heard about this. And I know it's true because I've been at conferences where they'll say it. The people who are the decision makers at those hospitals will explain this. And then you'll ask them if they'll want to go on the record, and the answer is always no. Proving something didn't happen is tough. So what we really need are some of those people at those hospitals to be willing to go on the record and say, no, we're not researching that. And that, you want to talk about shocking the conscience.
Yeah.
That will shock the conscience if we can get that story out. And maybe I'm just, I don't consider myself a journalist. So if somebody doesn't want to go on the record, I am not going to force them. And in fact, as many of you all know that as far as I'm concerned, as far as IP Watchdog is concerned, you are off the record unless you agree to go on the record. And I know that's not the way that journalists do it, but I don't want to get anybody in trouble. You have a job today, I want you to have a job tomorrow, but I'm getting frustrated to the point where I do think we need, and I won't violate the you're off the record part, but I need people to come and tell me their stories on the record so that we can use that information in Capitol Hill, because I'll tell you, I'm sure that the staffers and the members don't know that. They don't know that these hospitals aren't researching in that area. And it's diagnostics is the big one, right? Because you can't, and I think the Federal Circuit has even come to the conclusion that diagnostics are per se not patent eligible. And I heard years ago, and I won't say which judge it was because it was off the record, but it was at the Chamber of Commerce, and the judge gave a fireside chat there, and during the Q&A period, I stood up and I asked whether the judge and the court were familiar with the fact that the industry believed there to be a per se rule against diagnostic patents. Because something that was said during the conversation led me to believe that they didn't understand that. And I was told there's no per se rule against diagnostic patents, to which I said, Your Honor, I really respect you, and I don't want to challenge. I'm going to invite you to go and look at the body of law. And I said, I'll tell you what you'll find. You will not find a single diagnostic that has been patented over the last decade. And when one has snuck through, the Federal Circuit has killed it. And after that, I think the message, judge must have done that, because the next time I heard that person talk, left off the part that there's no per se rule against diagnostics.
It's just that every time.
It's just that every time. Yeah. If you give me one example, I'm willing to say it's not never, but we all know it is never now. And that sucks.
Yeah. And in my practice, I'm doing way, way fewer diagnostic patents. Like I remember 15 years ago, I was doing quite a bit, and now it's not happening.
Well, and how do you get a diagnostic patent? This is the greatest joke in the world, right? Because you go and search the patent office, and they do issue patents on diagnostics, but the way you get a diagnostic patented is by adding a treatment step. Okay, well, that's not a diagnostic patent, because you have to be able to diagnose it before you can treat it. So how many times are you going to have a diagnostic where the person who came up with the diagnostic actually knows how to add a treatment step that is other than just, oh, well, I suppose you could inject it, or I suppose you could turn it into a pill, and but it's crazy, and you see it. And I've taught patent prosecution, and I use those patents in particular because they are great to learn by. Because you can see where they're filed, you know what the patent attorney and the client want to get, and you see them chase it little by little by little, and then they finally capitulate and they add the treatment step, and then that's when the examiner says, okay.
And that logic makes zero sense, right? The only reason it works is because Justice Breyer said it in the opinion. Oh, well, this doesn't affect method of treatment patents. It sort of reminds me of like, this doesn't abrogate 101. It was just that one sentence like, oh, by the way, I'm not saying, it's a law of nature that a known treatment, a treatment is going to treat a disease. So this doesn't affect methods of treatment. So yeah, that's why we get there, and why we're adding a method of treatment claims sometimes when we have to. But the same logic, like there is no logic to it. Like, why is that any different than using the biomarker to diagnose something? It wasn't known. Yeah, it can, but just like the drug that existed to treat some disease, it could have done that all along, but it wasn't known that it could. That's a method of treatment. It wasn't known that you could use this biomarker to predict who had disease or what their prognosis would be. Why is that different? It's not.
Well,
to
it's
me.
the explanation is it's judge made, so it's made up as they go along, and that's why these cases don't make any sense. You can't rationalize these cases. I mean, I can tell you with great certainty what the outcome of any one-on-one analysis is going to be if you tell me what cases the judge is going to use in the decision. Yeah. It's not a mystery, right? If they're going to actually use Deere and Chakrabarty, then it's going to be eligible. If they're going to act like those two cases never happened, well, then guess what? You have zero chance. You lost. They're going to apply Funk Brothers and Parker v. Fluke and all this. And it's like you can't square that circle. You know, there's no way that all of these cases make sense. And I think that's why the Supreme Court has tapped out. I mean, I think they realize that they've screwed this up. They're not about to take the next case and make it any worse. I've been told by people who follow the Supreme Court that they thought they were solving the 101 issue the way that the industry wanted it to be solved. And it's been a shock to them to realize that all they did is make it worse and upset everybody.
Yeah. I know on that day the method of treatment didn't shock Justice Breyer's conscience. But didn't he even say, though, that, look, I'm just putting out, like, the outer boundary. Like, I leave it up to the Federal Circuit and others to fill it in and develop the contours of how it should be applied. I thought I heard him say that, if not in an opinion, but in speaking about it.
I don't know. But
if they didn't do that.
The problem is increasingly the appellate judges never spent any time being an attorney. They have no idea how their decisions are going to be used by real attorneys in court to persuade district court judges who were attorneys, were litigators almost universally so, and how what they say is going to get twisted and pulled, and then what that's going to mean to the district court's analysis, and then ultimately to the Court of Appeals analysis that handles way more cases than they handle. But on the Court of Appeals level and on the Supreme Court level, you don't get practicing attorneys. You get the people who are smarter than that and who are happy to tell you they're smarter than that they never practiced. They were law professors, or they were policy people in government, or they almost feels like our judiciary in some levels become a bit like the European approach to government. You have your best and brightest who never really spend time in the private sector, go straight into government, and they just know better because they're smarter than the rest of us. Well, what that leads to is a group of people who don't know. I mean, so like we were talking about 101, and obviousness type double patenting now gets mentioned in 101. And they say, oh, well, we're not taking a position. It says this doesn't affect that. No, but it certainly recognizes that. And if you're a lawyer, you know how that's going to get used in court. And they're not. And that's not to say anything bad about it, but I do think that they need to hear more voices from the practicing bar, because we can tell you, we can predict with great certainty what that's going to cause.
Yeah.
But maybe in the last few minutes that we have here, I appreciate you being here, spending time with us this week and today. But is there a happy message you want to leave people with? I mean, maybe the happy message is people, the scientists, are still really working. They still really care, and things are moving forward. Is that your perception?
Yeah, fortunately, I mean, the industry isn't crippled or shut down, but I do wish there'd be more inspiring promotion of it like there was in the 80s. Maybe it's just the time when I grew up and I'm nostalgic for it. But yes, there are still breakthroughs, there still are treatments, but I think we could be doing a whole lot more if legislation would promote it rather than check it and curtail it, which what seems to be happening.
We need to take the restrictor plates off and let this race car fly. Yeah. Well, great. That's a great place to end. I really appreciate it, Rob. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.